In a Moscow apartment on a cold night in April 1961, a Soviet colonel sat across from two Western intelligence officers and began to commit the ultimate betrayal. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, a decorated military officer with access to the Kremlin's most sensitive secrets, was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the Minox camera they handed him, so small it could fit in a closed fist, perfect for photographing classified documents. The British MI6 officer and his CIA counterpart watched carefully, gauging whether this man sitting before them was genuine or an elaborate Soviet plant designed to feed them disinformation. They had every reason to be suspicious. The KGB was notorious for its deception operations, and a GRU colonel volunteering his services seemed almost too good to be true. But as Penkovsky began speaking, detailing Soviet missile capabilities with precision that only an insider could possess, they realized they might have just recruited the most valuable spy in Cold War history. What they couldn't know was that Penkovsky's information would soon prevent nuclear war during humanity's closest brush with apocalypse. Oleg Penkovsky was born on April 23, 1919, in Vladikavkaz, a city in the North Caucasus region of Russia, during one of the most chaotic moments in Russian history. The Russian Civil War was raging, tearing the former empire apart as Reds fought Whites, revolutionaries battled monarchists, and various nationalist movements sought independence. Penkovsky's father, Vladimir, was an officer in the White Army, fighting against the Bolsheviks who had seized power in the October Revolution. That same year, Vladimir Penkovsky was killed in battle, dying for a cause that would ultimately lose. This fact, that his father had fought against the communists, would haunt Oleg his entire life, a dark secret that could destroy his career if fully known. Young Oleg was raised by his mother, who wisely obscured the details of his father's death, allowing her son to join the Soviet military without the stigma of being the child of a class enemy. But Penkovsky knew the truth, and it may have planted the first seeds of resentment against the system that had killed his father. Despite his father's history, or perhaps because of his need to prove his loyalty, Penkovsky threw himself into military service with exceptional dedication. He joined the Red Army in 1937, just as Stalin's Great Purge was reaching its height, when paranoia infected every level of Soviet society. He attended the Kiev Artillery Academy, graduating with honors in military engineering and earning promotion to lieutenant in 1939. When World War II came to the Soviet Union in 1941, Penkovsky served as an artillery officer, fighting in some of the war's most brutal campaigns. He was wounded severely in 1944, but survived, earning medals for his bravery and service. The war shaped him profoundly, as it did most Soviet men of his generation. He had seen the worst of combat, lost friends, witnessed the Nazi invasion's devastation firsthand. By war's end, he had reached the rank of lieutenant colonel and had earned the respect of his superiors, including one who would become crucial to his career, Chief Marshal of Artillery Sergei Vorontsov, one of the Soviet military's most powerful figures. After the war, Penkovsky continued his ascent through the Soviet military hierarchy. He attended the prestigious Frunze Military Academy from 1945 to 1948, one of the Soviet Union's top military institutions, where future generals and marshals were trained. His academic performance was excellent, his dedication unquestioned, his future seemingly unlimited. In 1949, he transferred from the regular army to the GRU, Glavnoye Razvedaltne Upravlenie, the main intelligence directorate, Soviet military intelligence. This was a significant move upward. The GRU was smaller and more secretive than the KGB, focused on foreign military intelligence rather than internal security. It recruited the best and brightest, and being selected for GRU service was a mark of distinction. Penkovsky attended the Military Diplomatic Academy from 1949 to 1953, training to be an intelligence officer, learning tradecraft, studying foreign languages, preparing for assignments abroad. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for the ambitious colonel. But beneath the surface of success, resentments were building. The first major crack in Penkovsky's loyalty came in 1955, when he was appointed military attaché in Ankara, Turkey, a prestigious foreign posting that should have been a career highlight. But the assignment went disastrously wrong. Penkovsky, perhaps too rigid about regulations, or perhaps genuinely shocked by violations he observed, reported his superior officer and several other GRU personnel for breaches of protocol. This was technically the correct thing to do, the kind of vigilance the Soviet system claimed to value. But in practice, reporting one's superiors was a dangerous move that marked someone as a troublemaker, someone who didn't understand the unwritten rules about protecting your comrades and not making waves. Penkovsky had done what he thought was right and been punished for it. The injustice of this burned inside him. Only the intervention of Marshal Vorontsov, his old wartime patron, saved his career, getting him a place at the Dzerzhinsky Military Academy to study rocket artillery. But the damage was done. Penkovsky had learned that the Soviet system didn't reward integrity. It rewarded loyalty to one's immediate circle, regardless of what regulations said. By 1960, Penkovsky had reached the rank of colonel and held a position that gave him extraordinary access to Soviet military secrets. He was deputy chief of the foreign section of the State Committee for Coordination of Scientific and Technical Research, a role that required him to collect scientific and technical intelligence on the West. In this capacity, he had access to classified information about Soviet missile programs, nuclear capabilities, military planning, and strategic weaknesses. He traveled occasionally to the West on official business, attending conferences and meeting with foreign scientists. He saw firsthand the prosperity and freedom of Western societies, so starkly different from the lies Soviet propaganda told about capitalist misery. He also saw that the Soviet Union was falling behind technologically, that Khrushchev's boasts about Soviet missile superiority were complete fabrications, that the entire Soviet strategic position was built on bluff and deception. All of this, the career setbacks, the injustices, the lies, the glimpses of the West, came together in Penkovsky's mind, and he made a decision that would change history. He would betray the Soviet Union. Not for money, though the West would offer it. Not because he'd been blackmailed or coerced, though those were common recruitment methods, but because he had come to hate the system he served and admire the West he was supposed to be gathering intelligence against. Penkovsky's first approach to Western intelligence was almost comically amateurish for someone trained in espionage tradecraft. In August 1960, he passed a letter to 2 American tourists in Moscow, hoping they would deliver it to the CIA. The letter declared his willingness to work for the West, offered valuable information, and dramatically stated, "I ask you to consider me as your soldier. Henceforth, the ranks of your armed forces are increased by 1 man." The tourists, probably terrified of being caught up in a spy operation in Moscow, didn't deliver the letter. Penkovsky tried again in January 1961, this time passing a package to another Western visitor. This attempt also failed to reach Western intelligence. Penkovsky must have been frustrated. Here he was, a GRU colonel with access to priceless intelligence, and he couldn't even make contact with the CIA. But his persistence would pay off. British MI6 had been cultivating a British businessman named Greville Wynne, who traveled to the Soviet Union regularly on trade business. Wynne was recruited to make contact with Soviet officials who might be willing to spy, and through a carefully orchestrated series of meetings, he was introduced to Penkovsky. The recruitment was handled with extreme caution on both sides. MI6 and the CIA, working jointly, needed to determine if Penkovsky was genuine or a KGB plant. Soviet intelligence was notorious for running sophisticated deception operations, and a GRU colonel volunteering his services seemed almost too good to be true. But as Penkovsky began speaking, detailing Soviet missile capabilities with precision that only an insider could possess, they realized they might have just recruited the most valuable spy in Cold War history. What they couldn't know was that Penkovsky's information would soon prevent nuclear war during humanity's closest brush with apocalypse.
In April 1961, Penkovsky traveled to London as part of a Soviet trade delegation, and this is when his espionage career truly began. Over the course of several days, he met extensively with MI6 and CIA handlers in a safe house, providing hours of detailed briefings about Soviet military capabilities. He described the Soviet missile program in detail, how many ICBMs they had, far fewer than Khrushchev claimed, how reliable they were, not very, what their ranges and accuracy were, limited. He explained Soviet strategic doctrine, described military command structures, identified KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western countries. He accepted training in using the Minox camera to photograph documents, learned tradecraft for servicing dead drops, memorized communications protocols. The debriefing sessions totaled nearly 140 hours, all transcribed and analyzed by dozens of intelligence analysts. Western intelligence couldn't believe their luck. Penkovsky was providing the kind of comprehensive intelligence that normally took years of painstaking work to assemble. And he was doing it willingly, driven by his own motivations, requiring relatively little handling. He was codenamed Hero by the CIA and Yoga by MI6, and both agencies agreed he might be the most valuable spy either had ever run. When Penkovsky returned to Moscow after his London trip, he began his real work, photographing classified documents. His position gave him access to extraordinary amounts of sensitive material, and he exploited that access with systematic thoroughness. Using the Minox camera hidden in his apartment, he photographed page after page of top-secret Soviet military documents, missile specifications, deployment plans, order of battle information, intelligence assessments, military research. He worked methodically, carefully, knowing that a single mistake could expose him. The documents were so numerous that processing them became a logistical challenge for Western intelligence. He passed the film to Greville Wynne during Wynne's visits to Moscow, using brief meetings and clever dead drops to transfer material without detection. Between April 1961 and September 1962, Penkovsky provided over 5,000 photographs of Soviet documents, totaling more than 7,000 pages of intelligence. This volume of material from a single source was unprecedented in Cold War espionage. Western intelligence analysts worked round the clock to process and analyze everything Penkovsky provided, and what they learned changed everything. The most valuable intelligence Penkovsky provided concerned Soviet missiles. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had engaged in aggressive nuclear saber-rattling, claiming that Soviet missile capabilities far exceeded American capabilities. He bragged about Soviet factories churning out ICBMs like sausages, implied that the Soviet Union could strike any target in the world with impunity, and used this claimed superiority to pressure the West on issues from Berlin to Cuba. American politicians and military planners took these claims seriously, worrying about a missile gap that had the Soviets far ahead in nuclear capability. This fear drove American military spending and strategic planning throughout the period. But Penkovsky's documents revealed that Khrushchev was lying. The Soviet ICBM program was far behind American capabilities. The Soviets had only a handful of operational ICBMs, not the hundreds Khrushchev claimed. The missiles they did have were unreliable, with guidance systems that often failed, and launch procedures that were cumbersome and time-consuming. Soviet intermediate-range missiles were more numerous, but still limited in number and capability. The intelligence Penkovsky provided allowed the West to call Khrushchev's bluff with confidence, knowing that Soviet strategic capabilities were vastly inferior to what Soviet propaganda claimed. This intelligence became crucial in October 1962, when American U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet missile installations being constructed in Cuba. President Kennedy and his advisors faced an agonizing decision: how to respond to Soviet missiles just 90 miles from American shores without triggering nuclear war. Penkovsky's intelligence gave them a crucial advantage. The photographs from Cuba showed SS-4 and SS-5 intermediate-range missiles, exactly the types Penkovsky had provided detailed information about. Western intelligence knew precisely what these missiles could do, what their ranges were, how long it took to make them operational, what their weaknesses were. Kennedy knew from Penkovsky's intelligence that Soviet ICBMs were limited in number and reliability, meaning a Soviet nuclear strike on the United States would be limited and the American response would be overwhelming. This knowledge allowed Kennedy to negotiate from a position of strength during the Cuban Missile Crisis, knowing that despite Soviet posturing, the strategic balance favored the United States. He could impose a naval blockade of Cuba and demand the missile's removal, confident that Khrushchev was bluffing when he threatened nuclear war. Penkovsky's intelligence didn't cause the crisis resolution, but it gave American decision-makers the confidence to stand firm, and that confidence may have prevented the crisis from escalating into nuclear war. But even as Penkovsky's intelligence was proving its value during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his espionage career was unraveling. The KGB had become suspicious. Soviet counterintelligence had noticed small anomalies. Penkovsky's lifestyle seemed slightly too comfortable for his official salary. He had unexplained gaps in his schedule, contacts with foreigners that seemed inappropriate. The KGB began surveillance, watching his apartment, following him through Moscow, monitoring his communications. They couldn't prove anything yet, but their suspicions were growing. Making things worse, British intelligence officer George Blake, who had attended meetings where Penkovsky's intelligence was discussed, was actually a KGB mole. Blake had been spying for the Soviets since the 1950s, and though he didn't know Penkovsky's identity initially, he provided information that helped the KGB narrow down who might be leaking such valuable intelligence. The net was closing, and Penkovsky either didn't realize it or couldn't stop himself from continuing to pass information even as the danger grew. On October 22nd, the same day President Kennedy announced the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba and imposed the naval blockade, KGB officers arrested Oleg Penkovsky in Moscow. The arrest was quiet, professional, giving Penkovsky no chance to resist or flee or commit suicide with the poison pill he'd been given by Western intelligence. He was taken to Lubyanka prison, the KGB's headquarters in central Moscow, a place synonymous with interrogation, torture, and death. His apartment was searched, revealing the Minox camera, undeveloped film, communications equipment, and other espionage materials. Greville Wynne was arrested simultaneously in Budapest, where he had been on business. Both men were now in Soviet custody, facing charges of espionage that carried the death penalty. Western intelligence immediately began assessing the damage. How much had Penkovsky revealed under interrogation? Had he compromised other operations? Were other agents at risk? The answers would come slowly over the following months, but one thing was immediately clear. The most valuable spy operation of the Cold War was over. The interrogation of Penkovsky was conducted by some of the KGB's most skilled interrogators, including Alexander Zagvatstin, who later said Penkovsky was questioned perhaps 100 times. The sessions were brutal psychologically, if not always physically. The KGB wanted everything: names of his handlers, details of every document he'd photographed, information about Western intelligence methods, confessions that could be used at trial. Penkovsky had been trained to resist interrogation, but training only goes so far when faced with the full apparatus of a hostile intelligence service that has unlimited time and no constraints on methods. Soviet interrogation techniques were sophisticated, combining physical deprivation, psychological pressure, isolation, false promises, and, when necessary, outright torture. Penkovsky held out as long as he could, but eventually he began talking. How much he revealed is still debated.
Soviet accounts claim he confessed everything, while some Western analysts believe he held back crucial information, even under extreme pressure. What's clear is that the interrogation extracted enough information to build a comprehensive case against him and to damage Western intelligence operations.
The trial of Oleg Penkovsky began on May 7, 1963, in a Moscow courtroom, a public spectacle designed to humiliate the West and demonstrate Soviet counterintelligence prowess. Penkovsky stood in a cage, literally a metal cage in the middle of the courtroom, wearing his military uniform stripped of insignia and medals, a visual symbol of his fallen status. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the Minox camera and films, copies of documents he'd photographed, testimony from KGB officers who had surveilled him, his own confession extracted during interrogation. Greville Wynne was tried alongside him, charged with being a British intelligence courier. The trial was broadcast on Soviet television, showing the population how the state dealt with traitors and foreign spies. Penkovsky appeared diminished, broken, a far cry from the confident colonel who had believed he was serving a higher cause. When asked why he betrayed his country, Penkovsky gave answers that combined genuine feelings with what his captors wanted to hear: resentment over career setbacks, admiration for the West, greed for Western money, vanity and desire for recognition. Some of this was probably true. All of it served the state's narrative about what motivated traitors. The verdict was never in doubt. On May 16, 1963, Penkovsky was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. Wynne received 8 years in prison, but would later be exchanged for Soviet spy Gordon Lonsdale in April 1964. Penkovsky's execution occurred quickly after sentencing, though the exact details remain murky and disputed. The official Soviet account claimed he was shot by firing squad, the standard method of execution for traitors. But rumors circulated for years that his death had been more theatrical and cruel. Some claimed he was burned alive in a crematorium furnace while still alive. Others said he was tied to a board and fed into a furnace slowly. His execution filmed and shown to military officers as a warning about the fate of traitors. These stories were likely Soviet disinformation, designed to terrify potential spies, but they illustrated the hatred the KGB felt toward Penkovsky. Whether he died quickly by bullet or suffered a more horrific end, the result was the same. By mid-May 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was dead, executed at age 44 for betraying the Soviet Union. The intelligence Penkovsky provided had consequences far beyond his own fate. The detailed information about Soviet military capabilities informed Western strategic planning for years. NATO adjusted its force postures based on what Penkovsky revealed about Warsaw Pact weaknesses. The US and Britain recalibrated their estimates of Soviet missile numbers and capabilities, allowing for more accurate strategic assessments. The exposure of Soviet agents operating in the West, based on Penkovsky's identification of KGB officers, damaged Soviet intelligence operations in multiple countries. And perhaps most importantly, Penkovsky's revelations about Soviet strategic weakness gave Western leaders confidence during the Cuban Missile Crisis to stand firm against Soviet threats, potentially preventing nuclear war. Some historians have argued that Penkovsky's intelligence was decisive in resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully. That without his information, Kennedy might have been less willing to risk confrontation with Khrushchev, or might have made different decisions that led to escalation. This is probably overstating the case. Multiple factors contributed to the crisis resolution, but Penkovsky's intelligence was clearly valuable and influential. Penkovsky's motivations for betraying his country remain a subject of debate among historians and intelligence analysts.
The KGB claimed he was motivated primarily by greed and vanity, wanting Western money and recognition. But this explanation seems insufficient given that he took enormous risks for relatively modest financial gain. A more complex explanation considers his career resentments, the recall from Turkey that he saw as unjust punishment for doing the right thing, the sense that the Soviet system didn't appreciate merit or integrity. There was also ideological disillusionment. Penkovsky had access to classified information showing that Soviet propaganda was built on lies, that Khrushchev's boasts about Soviet capabilities were false, that the Soviet system was failing its people. His trips to the West showed him societies that were more prosperous and free than Soviet propaganda admitted. And there was his family history. His father's death fighting against the Bolsheviks, a secret that Penkovsky carried and that may have influenced his loyalty to a system that would have condemned him if his father's true allegiance became known. All these factors combined to transform a loyal Soviet officer into the West's most valuable spy. The Penkovsky case had profound effects on Soviet intelligence and counterintelligence. The KGB conducted extensive damage assessment, trying to determine exactly what had been compromised. They reviewed security procedures at all levels, implementing stricter controls on access to classified information. The GRU, humiliated by having one of their own colonel turned traitor, conducted purges and investigations, looking for other potential traitors and tightening internal security. Trust between Soviet military intelligence and the KGB became even more strained than it had been, with both organizations blaming the other for security failures that allowed Penkovsky to operate for so long. Soviet intelligence officers who had worked with Penkovsky fell under suspicion, their careers damaged or destroyed by association with the traitor. The entire Soviet intelligence establishment became more paranoid, more suspicious of their own people, more focused on internal security at the expense of operational effectiveness. For Western intelligence, the Penkovsky case was both a triumph and a tragedy. The intelligence he provided was extraordinarily valuable, possibly the most important intelligence of the Cold War. But his capture and execution were devastating. Western intelligence had promised to protect him, to exfiltrate him if necessary, and they had failed to do so. Analysts debated whether they had pushed Penkovsky too hard, demanded too much intelligence too quickly, exposing him to unnecessary risk. Could he have been extracted before the KGB closed in? Should handlers have recognized earlier that he was under surveillance? These questions haunted intelligence professionals involved in the operation. MI6 officer Greville Wynne, who had served as Penkovsky's courier and was imprisoned for his role, later wrote about the experience, describing Penkovsky as brave and idealistic, someone who truly believed in what he was doing, knowing the risks. Wynne's book portrayed Penkovsky sympathetically, though some details were disputed or embellished. The ethical dimensions of the Penkovsky case are complex and uncomfortable. Western intelligence agencies recruited a Soviet officer, encouraged him to commit treason, provided him with equipment and training to steal secrets, and ultimately failed to protect him when he was caught. Penkovsky's execution was the predictable result of being caught spying. He knew the risks when he volunteered. But does that absolve Western intelligence of moral responsibility for his death? Intelligence professionals argue that Penkovsky made his own choice, that he volunteered his services and understood the dangers, that Western intelligence didn't force or coerce him. Critics respond that intelligence agencies have a moral obligation to protect their assets, that Penkovsky trusted the West's promises of protection, and that using someone's information while failing to safeguard them is a form of exploitation. There's no easy answer to these moral questions. Espionage by its nature involves recruiting people to betray their countries, putting them at enormous personal risk, and sometimes failing to protect them adequately. The intelligence gained may serve important purposes, possibly preventing war, saving lives, but individual agents pay the price. Penkovsky's family suffered terribly after his arrest. His wife and children were stigmatized as relatives of a traitor, facing social ostracism and limited career prospects. In the Soviet system, the sins of the father were visited upon the children, and being related to someone convicted of treason marked you for life. This collective punishment of traitors' families was standard Soviet practice, designed to deter potential spies by making clear that betrayal would destroy not just the traitor, but everyone they loved. It was cruel and effective, and it meant that Penkovsky's decision to spy affected far more lives than just his own.
In the decades since Penkovsky's execution, his story has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films. The most recent major treatment was the 2021 film The Courier, starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Greville Wynne and Merab Ninidze as Penkovsky. The film portrayed Penkovsky sympathetically as a brave man who risked everything to prevent nuclear war, motivated by conscience rather than greed. This heroic portrayal reflects a Western perspective on his actions. From that viewpoint, Penkovsky was indeed a hero who helped save the world from nuclear war. But from a Russian perspective, he remains a traitor who betrayed his country for personal reasons disguised as principle. These competing narratives reflect fundamentally different values about loyalty, patriotism, and individual conscience. Can betraying your country ever be justified? Does it matter what your motivations are? Can someone simultaneously be a traitor and a hero? Penkovsky's story forces us to grapple with these uncomfortable questions. The intelligence methods Penkovsky used, photographing documents, passing film through dead drops and couriers, traveling abroad on official business while meeting handlers, were standard espionage tradecraft that remains relevant today. Modern spy technology has advanced enormously with digital communications and cyber operations, but human intelligence gathering still relies on many of the same fundamental techniques. Someone with access to classified information is still the most valuable intelligence asset. Dead drops and covert communications are still used when electronic methods are too risky. The challenges of recruiting and handling human sources remain essentially unchanged, identifying potential recruits, assessing their motivations and reliability, providing them with tools and training, protecting them from counterintelligence, and extracting maximum intelligence while managing risk. The Penkovsky case is still studied in intelligence training programs as an example of successful human intelligence operations, though also as a cautionary tale about the limits of what intelligence agencies can do to protect their sources. Comparing Penkovsky to other famous Cold War spies reveals interesting patterns. Unlike Aldrich Ames or Robert Hanssen, who spied for the Soviet Union against the United States, Penkovsky wasn't motivated primarily for money. Unlike Kim Philby or the Cambridge Five, who were ideological converts to communism, Penkovsky wasn't driven by belief in the opposing system's superiority. His motivations were more personal and complex: career resentment, disillusionment with Soviet lies, admiration for the West, desire for recognition. This makes him harder to categorize than spies with clearer ideological or financial motivations. It also makes him perhaps more interesting as a case study in human motivation and behavior. He was neither purely mercenary nor purely idealistic, but something in between, driven by a mixture of wounded pride, genuine conviction, and personal ambition that defies simple characterization.
The security failures that allowed Penkovsky to operate for as long as he did are instructive for counterintelligence professionals. He held a sensitive position with access to classified information, traveled abroad where he could meet Western intelligence, had opportunities to photograph documents, and showed subtle behavioral indicators that might have raised flags: lifestyle somewhat beyond his means, contacts with foreigners, unusual scheduling gaps. The KGB eventually caught him, but not before he had operated for over a year and provided thousands of pages of classified documents. This suggests that even sophisticated counterintelligence systems have significant blind spots, especially when the spy is a trusted insider with legitimate access and good tradecraft. Modern insider threat programs try to identify potential spies through behavioral monitoring, financial audits, and technical surveillance. But determined insiders with good operational security can still evade detection for extended periods. The Penkovsky case reminds us that human factors, trust, institutional loyalty, and personal relationships often trump security procedures, and that some level of insider threat is probably inevitable in any organization handling classified information. The long-term impact of Penkovsky's intelligence is difficult to quantify precisely, but historians generally agree it was significant. The detailed information about Soviet military capabilities informed U.S. strategic planning for years after his death. The missile intelligence proved particularly valuable, allowing U.S. analysts to accurately assess Soviet strategic forces and adjust American posture accordingly. The exposure of Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover disrupted KGB operations in multiple Western countries. And the psychological impact of the Penkovsky case on Soviet intelligence, the knowledge that a trusted GRU colonel had betrayed his country so comprehensively, created lasting paranoia and suspicion within Soviet intelligence services that may have hindered their effectiveness for years. Some analysts argue that Penkovsky's intelligence, by revealing Soviet strategic weakness, emboldened the United States to pursue more aggressive Cold War policies in the 1960s, contributing to escalation in places like Vietnam. This argument is controversial and difficult to prove, but it illustrates how intelligence from a single source can have complex and unexpected consequences. Today, more than 60 years after Penkovsky's espionage career, his legacy remains contested. In the West, he is generally remembered as a valuable intelligence source who provided crucial information that may have helped prevent nuclear war. Intelligence historians rank him among the most important spies of the Cold War, and his story is taught as a case study in successful intelligence operations. In Russia, his memory is more complicated. Official Russian sources still referred to him as a traitor who sold his country's secrets for personal gain. But there's also some recognition, even in Russia, that his motivations were more complex than simple greed, that he was a product of a system that often punished integrity and rewarded conformity. The question of whether Penkovsky's actions were justified remains impossible to answer objectively. It depends entirely on one's perspective regarding loyalty, patriotism, and individual conscience versus collective obligation. Oleg Penkovsky's story is ultimately a tragedy about a man caught between systems, between loyalties, between his conscience and his duty. He was a decorated military officer who had served his country bravely in war, but who became disillusioned with the lies and corruption he saw around him. He admired the West and came to believe that Soviet policies threatened world peace. So he made the decision to betray his country, providing its greatest adversaries with its most sensitive secrets, knowing that if caught, he would face execution. For 18 months, he lived a double life, serving the Soviet Union by day while undermining it by night, photographing classified documents in his Moscow apartment, passing microfilm to Western handlers, providing intelligence that shaped Western strategy during the Cold War's most dangerous crisis. And when he was finally caught, he faced the consequences with the same courage he had shown in wartime combat. enduring brutal interrogation, public humiliation at trial, and ultimately, execution. Whether he was a hero or a traitor depends on where one stands, but there's no question that he was a significant figure whose actions influenced one of history's most dangerous confrontations, and whose story illuminates the human dimension of Cold War espionage in all its moral complexity.